From the moment he stepped out onto that Vatican balcony in 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, made one thing clear. He would not be a traditional pope. Gone were the red velvet shoes. Gone was the palatial residence of the Apostolic Palace. He chose instead a modest room in the Domus Sancti Marthi guest house, where he'd greet visitors with warmth, humility, and a plate of simple food if you were lucky. In the eyes of many, he became a pope for the people, a man who lived as close to the ground as his title would allow. Unlike his predecessors, Francis turned down the standard papal salary. By Vatican estimates, that would have meant roughly $32,000 a month, money he publicly claimed he didn't need. He said he didn't want to be isolated by wealth, privilege, or position. In interviews, he'd shrug off questions about retirement benefits, personal security, or property. The shepherd must smell like the sheep, he once said. For over a decade, that idea guided everything he did, from his outreach to the poor to the way he moved through the Vatican without an entourage. Even his choice of transportation reflected that philosophy. Instead of using the traditional black Mercedes or papal limousines, Francis was often seen stepping into a battered Ford Focus. Pope Francis blessed a group of 35,000 Harley-Davidson bikers in St. Peter's Square. He gave away the Harley-Davidson he was gifted, sold off a luxury car for charity, and asked bishops to resist the temptation of flashy cars. For most people watching from afar, the message was loud and clear. Pope Francis had no interest in riches, not even if they were handed to him in a golden envelope. So when people discussed the Vatican's vast wealth, estimated between $10 billion and $15 billion, they rarely associated it with him personally. Those were institutional assets, not personal ones. He didn't live in a palace. He didn't dine like royalty. He refused lavish renovations and spent more time with janitors than with dignitaries. He would often be found praying in silence, sneaking out at night to visit homeless people or spending time with those society often forgot. Public documents reflected this minimalism. No personal property, no known bank accounts, no family trust, and no indication that he planned on leaving behind any form of wealth. For years, Vatican insiders would say, if Pope Francis left anything behind, it's likely just a few books and a worn-out Bible. But that's where the story gets more complicated, because despite all outward signs, despite all the modesty and restraint, there were whispers, just faint ones, about how the unused salary was being handled. No one paid much attention at the time. After all, it was the Vatican. Things worked in mysterious ways. But now, in the days after his passing, people are looking back with sharper eyes. Did he really decline everything, or was there more nuance to his choices? And if he had nothing, then why did a certain envelope leave one woman in Argentina weeping uncontrollably? Before we get to that part of the story, it's important to understand the quiet mechanics behind his daily life. Because, while the Pope may not have cared for riches, he did care about people, especially the ones who stood by him before the white robes and global spotlight. And some of them, it turns out, were never forgotten. Even in silence, Francis may have been setting something aside, not for himself, but for someone who mattered more than gold. And that, well, that changes everything. Quiet financial habits no one noticed. It's easy to assume that someone who rejects a salary simply lets the money vanish. But things at the Vatican don't work that way. When Pope Francis turned down his monthly stipend, the funds didn't just evaporate into thin air. In fact, those close to the administrative side of Vatican operations say there's a little-known mechanism in place. When a pope declines his salary, those funds are quietly redirected, sometimes toward charities, sometimes toward foundations, and sometimes, if the pope authorizes it, into holding accounts designated for future use. We came to the Pope's audience because we wanted to give him a certificate making him an honorary member of our group of Fratres of San Cassiano blood donor volunteers. Officially, Pope Francis always refused his salary. But behind the scenes, it appears the Vatican was still budgeting for it. And according to internal sources, a portion of that amount over time was deposited into a trust under his name, not for personal use, but for discretionary spending. Discretion that by its very nature was never announced or published. It sounds paradoxical. A man who preaches poverty, yet still possesses the legal means to direct 6 figures a year. But Francis was never about optics. He was about intent, and intent can hide a lot in plain sight. Most popes before him spent freely within their role, using stipends for travel, gifts, personal upkeep, and occasionally even retirement planning. Francis, on the other hand, funneled most of what was allocated to him into social causes, especially ones tied to Argentina, where he remained emotionally tethered. Homes for orphans, medical care for impoverished families, scholarships for young seminarians from underfunded regions. Some of these donations were publicized, most were not. What's even more curious is that Francis never set up a personal foundation bearing his name, like many modern religious leaders or public figures. He didn't build monuments to himself. But there is now evidence that he worked through intermediaries, 2 of them reportedly linked to Jesuit financial networks in Latin America, who helped structure and maintain a trust quietly accumulating over the years. So why the secrecy? Some insiders suggest it was his way of staying true to the vow of poverty while still acting as a provider. To the public, he was the Pope who lived in a guest house, but privately, he may have been managing the only form of inheritance he could justify. Several religious scholars pointed out how rare this kind of posthumous gesture was. Usually when popes pass, said one Vatican historian, their legacy is debated in terms of doctrine, reform, and papal encyclicals. Very rarely does it come down to one handwritten letter and a fund with a name that doesn't even belong to a church. This is a different kind of legacy. But maybe the most powerful response came from where Pope Francis might have least expected it: the next generation of clergy. A group of young priests in Colombia held a vigil in his memory and read his letter aloud. Afterward, they began organizing a fundraising campaign inspired by what they called the Bergoglio method, giving quietly, without recognition, but with immense impact. Even Jesse Waters, who reignited the entire conversation, returned to the subject a few nights later. He played a short clip from the initial segment and then added, "I've covered popes, politicians, and billionaires, but this one managed to outgive them all without telling anyone." In the weeks that followed, donations poured into the small community foundation that Maria Elena had been asked to oversee. She declined to give interviews, but she did release one statement through the archdiocese. It was clear the story had struck a chord, not because a pope had left behind a fortune, but because for once, that fortune wasn't about wealth at all. It was about love, loyalty, and the quiet power of remembering where you came from. A legacy. No golden crown, no royal inheritance. Just one letter, one trust, and a legacy that rewrote everything people thought they knew about Pope Francis. While headlines chased numbers and pundits debated motives, Maria Elena didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her tears said more than any press conference ever could. She'd spent her life in the background, never photographed at the Vatican, never given a formal title, never asked for a thing. And in the end, her brother, who carried the weight of the church, the burden of history, and the expectations of 1 billion followers, chose to leave it all, not in a monument, not in a statue, but in her hands. Hands that had once wiped his tears, held his face, and written back every time he mailed a letter from Rome. The trust he created wasn't just about money. It was a message. It said, "I saw you. I didn't forget." It said, "This is for the times you stayed silent, for the times you gave when no one saw, for the life you lived in my shadow but never resented." It said thank you. Jesse Waters, whose reporting first brought this to light, didn't sensationalize the end. In his final coverage, he looked straight into the camera and said, "This wasn't a twist. This was the truest version of Francis. He didn't leave gold. He left dignity, and that's what made his family cry." As the world moves on, as a new conclave approaches and the church prepares for another chapter, There's a story still quietly unfolding in Argentina, a story of a small foundation now flooded with donations, of clinics being built, shelters being expanded, and one woman who never sought attention, now carrying out her brother's final wishes, quietly, faithfully, and without ceremony. In the end, Pope Francis didn't just preach humility, he planned it. He turned every unused check, every ignored benefit, into something lasting, something personal. And when he passed, it wasn't the church that cried first, it was his sister. If a man who gave up everything still found a way to give even more in the end, what does that say about the legacy we choose to leave behind?